I welcome you all to our today's public talk on Climate Change, Energy Strategies for Mitigation. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest speaker for today, Ambassador Shafqat Kakakhel, has served as the UN Assistant Secretary General, UNEP. He's a former member of Pakistan's diplomatic service and has also served as Deputy Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme for nearly a decade. During his tenure in Delhi, Ambassador Shafqat Kakakhel presented Pakistan as permanent representative to the UN Environment Programme and the UN Centre for Human Settlements Habitat from September 1994 to August 1998. Ambassador Shafqat Kakakhel represented Pakistan at the Rio+5 conference and the Kyoto Climate Change meeting in 1997. In August 1998, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan appointed him as Deputy Executive Director of UNEP with the rank of UN Assistant Secretary General, a position he held until his voluntary retirement in December 2007. Ladies and gentlemen, I now request Director General, Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad, Ambassador Aizaz Ahmed Chaudhry for his welcome remarks.
This year we have organized two events on energy issues of Pakistan and one on climate change. Dr. Ziad Al-Adad, he's here, Dr. Gulfraz and Dr. Adil Najm spoke at this forum. We are happy that we are continuing this discourse as the topic for today's public talk is critically important, especially for Pakistan, which is the 8th most affected country by climate change. While we are convinced that the climate change is happening, is a reality, what is needed is urgent adaptation actions without compromising our development needs and goals. That's the challenge. Three aspects are important: reduce domestic emissions from all sectors, encourage local adaptation strategies involving local stakeholders, and work with international support and programs such as Green Climate Fund. Mitigating the impacts of climate change is one side of the story. Living with the impacts is another. Therefore, ignoring the impacts of climate change is no longer an option. Just look at the array of key climate change manifestations that impact Pakistan. Increased variability of monsoons, receding Himalayan glaciers with impact on the Indus River system, decreased capacity of water reservoirs, reduced hydropower during drought years, and extreme events including flash floods and droughts. Other potential climate change-induced impacts include severe water stress, food insecurity due to decreasing agricultural and livestock production, more prevalent pests and weeds, and degradation of ecosystems and biodiversity loss. Higher temperatures may affect the composition, distribution, and productivity of mangroves, while lower precipitation could contribute to salt stress. Imagine if water of sea level continues to rise, if floods occur more frequently, if droughts happen and glaciers melt. Water stress could quickly become a food security issue. Pakistan has rightly supported and engaged with international partners to mitigate impacts of climate change. However, there are indicators that it will now be nearly impossible to meet the Paris Accord target of restricting climate change to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. This means that the countries like Pakistan must get ready for living in a world with climatic impacts. The developing countries like Pakistan will have to bear the bulk of the burden itself. If in the past two events that we organized on energy issues, we had noted the need for an integrated energy plan with participation from public and private sector stakeholders. We hope to hear more about it in today's talk. I hope that you would find today's public talk useful and this institute would continue to stimulate discussion on this important topic. Thank you again for coming.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. At the outset, I'd like to thank my Foreign Service colleague and friend, Ambassador Aizaz Chaudhry, for inviting me to speak on the subject of energy strategies for mitigation. As we all know, energy is indispensable for promoting socio-economic development and human welfare. But energy derived from fossil fuels has been recognized as a major driver of climate change, which has now been accepted as a major threat and a defining challenge of our age. The developing countries like Pakistan and other energy deficient countries face the conundrum of how to ensure their energy security, but to do so in a manner that would not exacerbate the destabilization of climate change. Over the years, the scientific community has come up with a solution, and that is the inclusion of a large share of clean energy derived from renewable sources, which will help in realizing the twin objectives of meeting the energy needs of developing countries as well as respond to the global agenda of restoring the stability of the global climate. So basically in my presentation, I will try to address the twin challenges or the energy climate change nexus. But in doing so, I'll review very briefly Pakistan's energy profile, the problems of climate change, the impacts of climate change, and Pakistan's vulnerability. And somewhere towards the end of my presentation, I will make some suggestions for whatever they are worth. As far as our energy needs are concerned, since the 1960s, there has been an exponential growth in our energy needs as a result of population growth, as a result of economic development, industrialization, and the green revolution in agriculture. During the last decades of the last century, our needs were met largely from hydropower. We had Mangla, Tarbela, from the large deposits of gas available domestically, but towards the end, increasingly, from the import of oil. From 2000 onwards, the demand-supply gap began to widen until it reached, during 2008 or so, very dangerous proportions. We almost had an energy crisis, which was marked by frequent resort to the practice of so-called load shedding, which is denying electricity to homes, factories, schools, hospitals, everyone. The impact on the economy was negative. There was a loss of almost 4% of our GDP as a result of the shortfall in energy, which reached a figure of 8,500 megawatts, almost 40% of our needs in 2012. So, Pakistan, the government, embarked upon an ambitious program of energy production, including for the first time in the history of Pakistan, a large number of coal-fired projects, nearly half of which were presented for financing during phase 1 of the CPEC. So as a result of those efforts, we also made efforts for renewable energy. We have now reached somewhere 35,000 megawatts or so and growing. But looking at Pakistan's situation today, we still have more than between 50 and 55 million people, particularly those in the rural areas, who lack access to reliable energy or any energy at all. Our energy needs are increasing by between 9 to 11% annually. So the conclusion obviously is that there is no question of complacency. There is no question of letting up on efforts to expand our energy supply, to carry out energy, to enhance energy use efficiency and conservation, as well as reduce the transmission and distribution losses. That is, in very brief words, the profile of our energy, namely the need for continued efforts to increase our energy supply. As far as climate change is concerned, in 1992, in a remarkable embrace of science and policy, more than 190 countries adopted the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, which represents the essential statement of global consensus on the drivers of climate change, on the impacts of climate change, and how the international community might respond to this challenge. As far as the driver or the drivers of climate change are concerned, it was agreed on the basis of solid, impeccable, incontrovertible scientific consensus that the emission, the release and concentration of greenhouse gases from the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, since the Industrial Revolution had resulted in improving living conditions and promoting economic development on a scale never seen in human history. But on the other hand, it had also destabilized the global climate, brought about an increase in the surface temperature, ocean temperature, and triggered a whole lot of changes the world over, which would have profound economic, social, and security impacts. It was recognized that since developed countries were mainly responsible for creating the crisis of climate, they would also take the lead in, first, slashing their greenhouse gas emissions, and second, providing assistance to developing countries in coping with the negative implications of climate change, as well as adopt a trajectory which will be less carbon intensive, which will be more climate friendly. The latest statement of global consensus on the global response to climate change is contained in the famous Paris Agreement, which was agreed in 2015. December 2015, all countries of the world were parties, but the United States, which had played a great role in the shaping of global climate change policy, under President Trump has decided to walk out of this agreement, causing a lot of consternation and problems for those who are in favor of a robust global climate action. What the main elements of the global consensus is that global climate change has been happening, it is happening, and it is likely to happen in the foreseeable future unless the international community is able to take steps to drastically reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, as well as take other remedial measures and mitigation. Secondly, that the achievement of the climate objective of climate stabilization cannot be achieved by any country or group of countries on their own. It is a truly global threat and global challenge which can only be met through concerted actions by nations and cooperation at bilateral, regional, and global levels. Another element of the consensus is that the international community has been able to establish an architecture of international cooperation and action. There is a Green Climate Fund to which developed countries will contribute at least $100 billion annually from 2020. There is also a mechanism for supporting developing countries in adaptation called Adaptation Fund. There is a technology mechanism which will help developing countries in achieving the requisite technological progresses which are absolutely indispensable for decarbonizing the economy, for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. And above all, there will be a mechanism, there is a mechanism, a network of capacity building organizations. Now, I should probably, Ambassador Azaz Ahmad Chaudhry mentioned the consequences of climate change, but I would like to mention them very, very briefly, that basically the impacts of climate change would include the melting of the Arctic ice and swelling of sea levels. The other impact will be rapid depletion of ice and snow from all the glacier systems. There are about 18 of them, including the Himalaya, Karakoram, Hindu Kush glacier system, which is one of the largest on the planet. That climate change and the climate destabilization will mean more frequent, longer lasting, and more intense extreme events such as floods and droughts, coastal storms, and heat waves. There will also be more extreme events such as tsunamis and hurricanes, as we have seen, including in the United States, and the recent hurricane affecting the coastal regions of Bangladesh and Assam in India, Hurricane Bulbul, which caused a displacement of 2.5 million people. Now, what will be the consequences of climate change? The consequences of climate change, number one, destruction and degradation of coastal regions, including the possible submergence and disappearance of islands and low-lying coastal areas, inundation of agricultural land, contamination and salination of fresh water, destruction of aquatic species, involuntary migration to safer places for alternative homes and livelihoods, the recession of glaciers and disruption of monsoon winds will eventually, Ambassador Azaz Chaudhry mentioned, eventually lead to reduced supply of fresh water, which will in turn affect energy generation as well as food production and food security. There will also be an increase in tropical waterborne diseases, epidemics, and overall deterioration of health standards, adversely affecting human security and economic productivity. As a whole, the impact of climate change, according to the last assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, will be slowing down of economic development and acceleration of the expansion and deepening of poverty. There will also be security implications of climate change, which I will not mention for the time being. If anyone is interested, I can mention that. Now, as far as Pakistan is concerned, unfortunately, Pakistan is vulnerable and acutely vulnerable to all the impacts of climate change that I have enumerated. Why? There are geophysical and topographical factors. Pakistan is located in a hot and humid climatic zone with very low, less than 200 millimeters of annual precipitation, except in parts of the north. Our population growth, 2.5% annually, accompanied by chaotic, unregulated urbanization. Our 1,000-kilometer-long coastal region, our poverty. We are a very poor country, which means poor, lower level of resistance in the face of calamities, man-made or natural. Our economy is heavily dependent on agriculture, which is heavily dependent on perennial irrigation, on freshwater supplies which come from two major sources, the glacial melt and the twice annual monsoons, both of which, the glaciers as well as the monsoons, are highly vulnerable to climate change. We also have, and I'm sure all of you know, our governance limitations and deficits. And what worries me mostly is that while we have an elaborate disaster management policies and strategies, early warning, disaster relief, at least at the federal level, our disaster management capacity is seriously constrained by limitations of resources. It is distressing to recognize that even today, by 2019, end of 2019, some of the communities displaced and some of the infrastructure destroyed by the 2010 floods have not been rehabilitated and revived. So, one of the problems of climate change could be that there could be an increase in tensions with India and Afghanistan. All our rivers, Pakistan depends for its freshwater resources on rivers which originate either in Tibet or in India or journey from Afghanistan into Pakistan. Critical dependence on transboundary rivers makes the adequate care for the management of our transboundary issues a very high priority imperative of our national security. Pakistan has responded to the challenge of climate change. In 2012, actually 20 years after the UN Convention on Climate Change was adopted, Pakistan was able to formulate an elaborate climate change policy, which was based on the recommendations of a task force, of which I was the principal technical advisor. So we have a policy of climate change in 2012, which contains lists of measures, policy interventions on all aspects of climate change. Mitigation, how can we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? Adaptations, how do we protect? Mr. Azaz mentioned, how do we protect our socio-economic development and our vital economic sectors from the ravages of climate change? There are also recommendations on development of scientific base in the country and strengthening the capacity of our institutions for dealing with the multi-dimensional challenges of climate change. Anyone among the public. So this clean energy policy, which has been in the making since February, in February 2019, the Cabinet Committee on Energy had approved this draft. It will not significant advance in the evolution in the efforts made by the government of Pakistan to promote clean and green and renewable energy. But we don't have an enviable record of implementation of policies. The 2012 climate change policy has turned into a wish list, a listing of beautiful expectations which have remained unfulfilled. The 2017 law, which is a very significant advance on climate change action, remains unimplemented, and the Prime Minister and others keep on adding new initiatives, forgetting that the National Parliament has already adopted a blueprint, has already approved the mechanisms. So we have to, if we want to implement, if we are serious about clean, green energy, if we are serious about dealing with the impacts of climate change, if we are serious about improving our credentials as a responsible member of the international community, we have to make determined efforts. There are tremendous windows of opportunity available from the global architecture of support and cooperation. But utilizing those windows, utilizing those venues of cooperation will require domestic actions, a series of domestic measures. There will, of course, a need for strengthening the human, technical, scientific capacity of the people dealing with these issues. I've heard that one of the major reasons why the Climate Change Authority has not been established is that the government simply cannot get candidates qualified enough to run a very sophisticated machine that will be called upon to formulate as well as analyze, approve projects for domestic implementation as well as funding through external sources. So a human resource revolution, a technical training, a technical competence revolution, and a technological revolution are the essential prerequisites for a transition to clean and green Pakistan, as well as the fulfillment of our commitments. That is how you can redirect your energy policies towards climate change mitigation, and I thank you.
First of all, I want to associate myself with a very warm welcome which the Director General ISSI, Ambassador Azaz Ahmed Chaudhry, has extended to all of you. Today we are addressing a subject which affects not only Pakistan but the whole world. And the gravity of the situation has been highlighted, underlined by a person, Ambassador Shafqat Kakakhel, who has long experience of having dealt with these issues in various capacities. And we are very fortunate that he found time to share his ideas with us on this important subject today. See, climate change is a relatively new subject. I recall that I was just first secretary working in Pakistan's mission to the UN in New York in 70s. And the preparatory meetings were being held for the first Environment Conference, Stockholm, in which the Canadian diplomat Maurice Strong was the leading light. And I was assigned to attend those meetings, preparatory meetings. When I went to those meetings, I saw very junior officials, like me, there, as if the missions are not attaching much importance to this subject. And my job, I didn't have any brief either on any of those issues which were being discussed, because it was a new subject in the 70s. And I would just report what happened and still don't get any guidance how to proceed further. But we have come a long way from that period. Now we have the famous 2015 Paris Agreement. It does contain a very, forward-looking framework of action, how to deal with this climate change, I must say, crisis. Today's, of course, discourse was with specific reference to energy, but I think, as was rightly pointed out, this is a very multidimensional issue. It cuts across population, urbanization, energy. So all these issues are the source of the, as I said, crisis of climate change we are facing. I need not go into all what has been said, that how this climate change is affecting the glaciers, the erratic monsoons, droughts, and so on, because this is not just a projection that what climate change can cause. We are already experiencing this, only yesterday our Prime Minister was in Lahore. He was talking of Lahore as becoming one of the most polluted cities in the world. I mean, we had heard before about Delhi, the same thing. And this is a living experience which must teach us how to cope with this problem. Of course, there are two ways. One is mitigation, adaptation, but that is not enough. Of course, that is important. What is required is a wholesome approach in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. Because Sustainable Development Goals, outline what needs to be done in not one but most of the priority areas which require our attention. Of course, things have to start from the very beginning. First is the creating of awareness. I think now gradually awareness is increasing among the people about this subject of climate change, but that is not enough. Today's is just a humble effort on the part of ISSI to at least raise the awareness about this issue. Now, what needs to be done? It has to be done at individual level, at institutional level, at policy making level. And in all these, at least as Pakistan is concerned, we are lacking, all the necessary wherewithal. At individual level, it is a question of awareness and self-education, how to preserve the climate and not to let it further deteriorate. At institutional level, Ambassador Shafqat Kakakhel has already told us how we have adopted a policy, established institutions. But all this is will be useful only if we have the capacity. So capacity building is also important at these levels. But also we need resources. So resources, of course, we have to mobilize as much as possible nationally. But there are windows available, Green Fund and, with all these things. And there the principle of a common but differentiated responsibility is being followed. Because it is rightly, stressed by the developing countries that the present state of affairs, so far as climate change is concerned, is primarily due to the activities undertaken by the developed countries in the past. Of course, it is a common responsibility now, but with a differentiated responsibility. And we are happy that developed countries are coming forward to help the developing countries in increasing their capacity to deal with this phenomenon. Nationally, I think we need to change our energy mix. Of course, there are non-renewable sources like coal, gas, and but I heard this discussion on from the anti-coal lobby, I must say. There is much truth in what they have said, but I think one has to see the things in their right perspective. What was the situation? Whoever may be responsible for whatever policies, but only a few years back, Pakistan had a very severe energy crunch. 12 hours, 14 hours of load shedding, industry coming to a screeching halt, exports declining, people's resentment, restlessness at homes. So all this government had to do something, Of course, this hydro power is a cheap source and eco-friendly, comparatively speaking. It should have been adopted, but that takes long period, 10 years, 6 years to build a dam and all these things. So would the country have waited for so long and keep on experiencing the kind of energy crunch we were facing? I don't think so. So this was a, like, in an emergency you need some, good injection. So I take it that way that ideally, of course, hydropower should have been the main source. But given the situation, I think we had no alternative but to go for some quick answer to our problems also. Now it cannot be undone. So we have to now see the forward looking, what needs to be done. Of course, we should now have more emphasis on hydropower and other sources of renewable sources of energy. Another problem which Pakistan faces is the 18th Amendment. Of course, this subject has become a provincial subject in most of the cases, and where there is no institutions, no capacity to deal with this subject. So I think we need to look at this problem of coordination, which is very much needed. And also rightly said that this is a global problem, but I think at least it is a regional problem, so far as Pakistan is concerned. And unfortunately, there is a lack of any cooperation at the regional level, despite the fact that SAARC has taken some tentative steps. But SAARC is dysfunctional, and pollution needs no territorial boundary. Smog and pollution of one city in India causes to Pakistan, and maybe vice versa. It depends upon the wind at a given time. So there is need for focusing on and cooperation to meet this climate change challenge at the regional level. I think we are lagging behind many other regions in this respect. So I would just conclude by saying that climate change is a real living challenge, and we cannot ignore it. And if we ignore it, it will be at the cost of not only this generation, but also for the coming generation. And we will be held responsible for that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. This brings us to the end of our today's public talk. I thank you all for coming here today. Please join us for tea and coffee at the back. Thank you.